Right now, somewhere on this planet, roughly half of the entire human population, not half of one country, half of everyone alive, will, at some point across a single month, stop what they're doing to watch grown men chase a ball around a field. Stadiums holding 100,000 people sell out in minutes. National economies quietly adjust their own television schedules around it. And every 4 years, one single trophy, gold-plated smaller than a house cat, gets lifted into the air in front of a global audience larger than any royal coronation, any moon landing broadcast, any single event in the entire history of mass media has ever managed to gather in one moment. Almost nobody watching that broadcast could tell you the name of the man who actually built this thing from absolutely nothing. Out of pure frustration, using a tiny, broke organization that, in its first few years, could barely afford to mail its own paperwork, fewer still could tell you that the whole project very nearly didn't survive its own first attempt, propped up by one country's willingness to personally foot the bill for guests who mostly never even showed up. Here's what almost nobody realizes about the tournament that now defines global sport more completely than any other event on Earth. It wasn't handed down by some ancient sporting tradition, and it wasn't the product of a large, well-funded institution with a grand master plan. It was invented, deliberately, and somewhat stubbornly, by one French administrator who had grown genuinely fed up with watching the best football on the planet get excluded from the biggest stage available to it, for reasons that had nothing to do with how well anyone actually played the game. Everything that followed, the trophy, the 4-year cycle, the audience now measured in billions, traces back to one man's refusal to accept that the sport's biggest stage should keep excluding its best players over a technicality about payment. In 1904, in a modest room in Paris, representatives from 7 European football associations, France, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, sat down and formally created an international governing body for the sport, an organization that would eventually become known worldwide simply as FIFA. In its earliest years, this new federation had barely any real authority, almost no money to speak of, and no unified international competition of any real significance to actually govern. Football at that point mostly existed as a patchwork of domestic leagues and the occasional exhibition match between touring club teams, with no single event capable of settling, in any meaningful way. Which nation actually produced the strongest players in the world? England, notably, the country most associated with codifying the modern game, didn't even join this new federation at its founding, viewing the whole international project with a degree of skepticism that would take decades to fully soften. In 1921, a French football administrator named Jules Rimet became president of this still small, still underfunded organization. Rimet had already spent years building French domestic football from the ground up, and he arrived at the international level carrying a specific, stubborn conviction that football belonged to the entire world, not merely to the handful of wealthy European clubs currently running it, and that the sport urgently needed one single tournament capable of proving that claim. Beyond any argument, he inherited an organization that, in practical terms, functioned more like a loose correspondence club than a governing body. Member federations communicated mostly by letter, annual dues were modest, and frequently paid late. And the entire operation ran on the volunteer time of administrators who held full-time jobs elsewhere. Turning that fragile arrangement into something capable of organizing a genuine global tournament would take Rimet the better part of a decade of persistent, often frustrating internal argument. For years, the biggest football stage available internationally was the Olympic Games. But the Olympics of that era enforced a strict, amateur-only rule, barring any player who received payment for playing the sport. That restriction quietly excluded a growing number of the strongest teams and players in the world, at the exact moment football was becoming genuinely professionalized in several countries. Uruguay, a small South American nation, with a fiercely serious football culture, won Olympic gold in both 1924 and 1928, and did so playing a fast, sophisticated style that stunned European crowds who had never seen South American football at that level before. Uruguay's Olympic dominance created an obvious, uncomfortable problem. Here was clear proof that some of the finest football on the planet was now developing entirely outside Europe, in a competition that couldn't fully showcase it because of a rule with nothing to do with actual skill. Rimet saw this gap directly, and he saw an opportunity in it. If the Olympics couldn't be football's true world championship because of an arbitrary amateur restriction, then football would simply need to build its own championship instead, with its own rules, open to every serious player regardless of whether they happened to be paid for their talent. Uruguay's own domestic game had professionalized rapidly through the 1920s, with clubs openly paying their best players even as international sporting bodies elsewhere continued to insist. Often for reasons more about class and tradition than fairness, that true athletic competition had to remain unpaid. Watching a small South American federation dominate the world's biggest amateur stage twice in a row, using players Europe's own amateur rules would have disqualified back home, was difficult for Rimet to interpret as anything other than proof that the current system had become genuinely obsolete. In 1930, at a FIFA Congress, Rimet's proposal for an entirely new, standalone World Championship tournament, open to professionals, was formally approved. The next decision was where to actually hold it, and the choice made was, by any modern standard, a genuine gamble. Uruguay was selected as host, partly because the country was the reigning Olympic football champion and clearly deserved the recognition, and partly because 1930 happened to mark the centennial of Uruguay's independence, giving the tournament a natural, symbolically rich occasion to attach itself to. There was one enormous practical problem with this choice. Uruguay sat on the opposite side of the Atlantic Ocean from nearly every strong European football nation, and in 1930, the only way to cross that ocean was by a boat journey that took 2 to 3 weeks each way. Most European football associations, already stretched thin financially, balked immediately at the cost and time involved. To rescue the entire tournament from collapsing before it had even begun, Uruguay's organizers agreed to personally cover the full travel expenses of any European team willing to make the trip. That commitment alone represented a significant financial gamble for a country of Uruguay's size, made on the strength of a tournament that, at the time the offer was made, had no track record whatsoever to justify the expense beyond Rimet's own persistent argument that it eventually would. In the end, only 4 European nations, France, Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia, actually accepted the offer and made the long ocean crossing, while the rest of Europe's strongest football nations simply stayed home. Several of the absent federations later described the decision as a straightforward matter of cost and calendar conflicts with their own domestic seasons. Though it's hard not to notice that the same federations had also been among the most publicly skeptical that a tournament held on another continent, organized by an association most of their own board members had never even visited, would amount to anything worth the expense of crossing an ocean for. The trophy created for this first tournament was a modest, elegant, gold-plated statue depicting Nike, the Greek goddess associated with victory, holding aloft an octagonal vessel above her head. Designed by the French sculptor Abel Lafleur. At the time, it was simply called the Victory Trophy, or sometimes the World Cup Trophy, with no individual's name attached to it at all. That changed in 1946, when FIFA's members voted to formally rename it the Jules Rimet Trophy, in direct recognition of the tournament he had spent nearly a decade fighting to bring into existence against considerable institutional resistance and outright skepticism from several of his own federation's member countries. It's worth noting just how uncertain the entire project genuinely was at the time. Multiple European football associations had publicly doubted whether a standalone professional world championship, held on another continent entirely, would draw any serious interest at all, or whether it might simply embarrass the sport instead. Some contemporary accounts suggest a handful of Federation officials privately expected the whole venture to be quietly abandoned after one attempt, treating it less as the founding of a lasting institution and more as an experiment that would likely need to be corrected back toward the Olympic model within a few years. Picture the scene aboard that ship in the summer of 1930, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, roughly halfway through a crossing that would take the better part of 3 weeks from end to end. The French squad trains as best it can, on a rolling, unstable deck, footballs occasionally lost entirely over the side rail into open water, never to be recovered. Card games run late into most nights out of sheer boredom. The novelty of ocean travel, having worn off somewhere around day 4. Nobody aboard that ship has any real way of knowing whether the tournament waiting for them on the other side of the ocean will be remembered as a landmark, moment in sporting history, or quietly forgotten within a few years as a strange, expensive experiment that never got repeated. Rimet himself is aboard a separate crossing, reportedly carrying the tournament's new trophy personally, rather than trusting it to standard cargo handling. A small gold statue representing an entire decade of stubborn institutional argument. Crossing an ocean in a coat pocket? It's a strange image to sit with, set against the modern tournament. No security detail, no armored case, no insurance policy large enough to matter. Just one tired administrator and a trophy nobody yet understood would eventually be worth defending that carefully. When the ships finally arrive in Montevideo, they're met with a welcome far larger and more enthusiastic than almost anyone associated with the tournament had quietly dared to expect. Massive crowds gathered at the docks. Genuinely excited for a tournament most of Europe's football establishment had openly written off as a doomed, overambitious gamble months earlier. Local newspapers had been tracking the ship's progress across the Atlantic for days, running updates on their expected arrival the way a modern outlet might track a major storm system. And by the time the vessels actually reached port, the arrival had taken on the feel of a genuine civic occasion, rather than a routine shipping delivery. Here's the turn. Uruguay went on to win that first tournament in 1930, beating Argentina in the final in front of a home crowd in Montevideo. And the gamble that so many European federations had quietly doubted suddenly looked like one of the shrewdest decisions in the entire history of organized sport. The 4 European federations that had actually made the crossing went home with a very different story to tell than the ones who'd stayed behind. And within a few tournament cycles, the absentees of 1930 were fighting to secure a place in a competition they had once dismissed as barely worth the boat fare. The tournament not only survived, it expanded steadily, decade after decade, eventually growing from the 13 teams that competed in that first nervous edition to 32 teams by the end of the 20th century, and 48 teams in the modern format. Countries that had never fielded a team in that first tournament, some of them not yet even existing as independent nations in 1930, would eventually build entire domestic footballing cultures around the ambition of one day qualifying for the same competition Rimet had struggled to convince a handful of skeptical European federations to even attend. The original trophy itself had a stranger, rockier journey than most fans realize. In 1966, shortly before that year's tournament in England, the Jules Rimet Trophy was stolen from a public exhibition and went missing entirely for about a week before it was eventually discovered, wrapped in newspaper, hidden under a garden hedge by a dog named Pickles, out on a walk with its owner. After Brazil won the tournament for a third time in 1970, FIFA's rules allowed them to keep the original trophy permanently, retiring it in favor of a new design. That original trophy was then stolen again from the Brazilian Football Federation's headquarters in 1983, and this time it was never recovered at all. Investigators eventually concluded it had almost certainly been melted down for its gold content, meaning the actual physical object Rimet once carried across the Atlantic in his coat pocket no longer exists anywhere in the world today. The tournament's growth over the following decades tracked almost exactly with the broader global spread of television, then satellite broadcast, then internet streaming, each new technology arriving just in time to expand the audience for the next edition. By the middle of the 20th century, it had already become the single most watched recurring event in the world, well before the internet made truly global, simultaneous audiences possible for anything else. You watch a final today on a screen the size of a wall, surrounded by friends, part of an audience stretching into the billions, streamed instantly to every continent on Earth at once. The tournament's own founder once carried its only trophy across an ocean, personally, in a coat pocket, on a ship that took 3 weeks to arrive, with no real guarantee that anyone waiting on the other side would even show up to watch. You assume an institution this massive, this globally dominant, must have been built by a large committee with unlimited resources and a clear master plan from day one. It was actually built by one stubborn Federation president, working inside an organization so poor in its early years that it could barely fund its own mail, betting an entire decade of his career on the idea that people on the other side of an ocean, in a country most of Europe couldn't confidently locate on a map, deserved a real chance to prove they belonged on the same stage as anyone else. The trophy that proved him right no longer physically exists. The tournament it started now stops the planet twice a decade, without exception. Rimet died in 1956, 2 years after finally stepping down from the presidency he'd held for over 3 decades, and never lived to see the tournament reach anywhere near the scale it occupies today. He knew only the shakier, unproven early decades, the ones where the whole project could still plausibly have collapsed into a historical footnote instead of a global institution. This has been Foxholes. Stories. The next time that trophy gets lifted into the air, you'll know it very nearly never existed at all.